The HOA had quietly sold off 1,500 acres of private land right beside my lakeside cabin, a land I had poured 5 years of effort into improving. That morning, when I stepped outside, Karen, the HOA president, was standing at my door, waving a document with a red seal like it was a trophy. With a smug grin, she said, "You lost, old man." What she didn't realize was that the night before, I'd secretly recorded their entire home meeting using a small listening device. They thought I'd simply roll over. They were wrong. After combing through the HOA bylaws, I uncovered a loophole. Just a week later, I had the legal paperwork in hand that transferred ownership of Karen's entire neighborhood to me. Can you guess the trick I pulled? Comment below, because this is the legal move that broke the HOA. My name is Frank Miller. At 62. I figured the days of fighting battles were long behind me. After 3 decades working as a structural engineer and losing my wife, Martha, to cancer 3 years ago, all I wanted was peace and solitude at my lakeside cabin on Pine Ridge. But this wasn't just any cabin. My grandfather built it back in 1952, fresh from World War II, determined to create something lasting for our family. My father expanded it in the 70s. Adding the porch where Martha and I used to sip coffee and watch the sunrise turn the water golden. For 3 generations, the Millers had called this place home, and I intended to honor that legacy until my last breath. The 1,500 acres of wild, undeveloped land stretching from my boundary to the old hiking trail had become my personal mission over the last 5 years. Martha had dreamed of transforming that space into something beautiful, perhaps a sunflower-filled memorial garden overlooking the lake. After she passed, I couldn't let that dream die. Every weekend, I walked the land, cleared away litter, planted native flowers, and cut small trails for the neighbors who liked to stroll with their dogs. It wasn't officially mine, but it felt like an extension of my family's history. The county had listed it as conservation land since 1987, which I assumed meant it was safe from development. Turns out, I was not about local politics. One September morning, I was jolted awake by Bull, my golden retriever. Despite weighing 80 pounds, he's about as threatening as a stuffed animal, but his barking had me worried. I slipped into my slippers and went to the door, expecting a raccoon or maybe Mrs. Henderson, the nosy neighbor. Instead, my eyes landed on a glaring yellow sign staked right into the soil of the 1,500 acres. It read, "Land sold. Contact Pinnacle Development." My coffee mug slipped from my hands and shattered against the porch steps. 5 years of sweat, 5 years of keeping Martha's dream alive snatched away by some corporation. And the worst part? I already knew it was coming. The night before, I'd overheard everything. My neighbor, Jim Peterson, had been at war with the HOA over his barking dog. They fined him so often he got paranoid, convinced they were spying on him. Out of desperation, Jim planted a tiny listening device near the HOA's meeting spot. A month earlier, he forgot to turn it off. That Monday night, while checking my fence line, I heard voices through the device. Karen was there, bragging about how that old fool Miller wouldn't see it coming until the papers were signed. She laughed about clearing me out like dead weight and cashing in big. Standing there in my pajamas, recording every word on my phone, my hands trembled with fury. Now, staring at that bright sign in my land, I knew exactly what she'd meant. This wasn't just about property, it was about my family's promise to this place. Martha's dream, my father's lessons, my grandfather's sacrifice. Some things are worth fighting for. Fueled by rage, I stormed into my shed, grabbed an old shovel, and marched to the sign. I tried to rip it out of the ground, but the post was planted deeper than my grandfather's fence line. After 10 minutes of grunting and prying, I lost my footing and fell face first into the mud. My dog thought it was playtime and started leaping around me like a fool, which only made it worse. Then, like clockwork, Mrs. Henderson appeared with her phone, snapping pictures. "Straight to Facebook," she chirped, grinning like a cat. Battle of man versus Cigna and the signs winning. Within an hour, her post had dozens of comments and shares. The humiliation stung almost as much as the betrayal, but deep down, it fueled something else, resolve. Karen Smithfield had picked the wrong Miller. I cleaned myself up, put on my best jeans and the flannel shirt Martha always said made me look sharp, and dialed the number from the sign. A smooth, polished voice answered. Pinnacle Development, Jake Morrison speaking. I introduced myself and asked what was happening to the land beside my cabin. His tone shifted instantly, polite but cold, the way a doctor sounds before breaking bad news. Mr. Miller, you'll need to speak with your HOA representative. We purchased the property legally. All current occupants have 30 days to remove any structures or belongings. His words hit me like a hammer. 30 days to erase 5 years of labor. 30 days to abandon Martha's dream. 30 days to betray 3 generations of Miller legacy. But he wasn't finished. His voice stayed calm, almost rehearsed. I should also mention, our contract includes provisions for dealing with uncooperative residents. Failure to comply may result in legal action, with penalties exceeding $200,000. The message was clear. They didn't just want the land, they wanted to crush me financially. Jake ended the call with false sympathy that made my skin crawl. Nothing personal, Mr. Miller, just business. Have a blessed day. The line went dead. I sat there clutching my phone, staring at that cursed yellow sign, feeling more alone than I had since Martha's funeral. The next morning, I drove straight to the Willowbrook HOA office. Karen had turned that bland strip mall storefront into her personal empire. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, and the cold efficiency of a bureaucrat's lair. For 8 years, Karen Smithfield had ruled this community like a queen without a crown, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Karen wasn't new to this game. She'd already been thrown out of another HOA years earlier after neighbors revolted, accusing her of misusing funds and abusing her power. That humiliation hardened her ever since. She ruled with an iron fist, determined to crush opposition before it had the chance to grow. To Karen, even the smallest challenge to her authority was a threat to her very survival. Her office looked like a shrine to control. Laminated HOA violation notices plastered the walls. Before and after photos of enforcement victories were framed like war trophies. On one wall hung a massive poster listing all 247 community rules, while a color-coded map detailed which households had been fined in the past year. Like a general plotting a battlefield, her desk was placed squarely to face the door, ensuring anyone who walked in felt summoned before a principal. Behind her sat 2 stuffed filing cabinets labeled active violations and pending enforcement, both overflowing. This wasn't about protecting property values anymore. This was about raw dominance. At her side were 2 loyal lieutenants. Maggie Chen, the secretary, was a jittery woman in her 50s who carried a clipboard everywhere, scribbling down every word like a court stenographer. Years ago, she'd been unfairly fined by another HOA over a single garden gnome, and ever since, she clung to the belief that obsessive record-keeping was the only safeguard against injustice. Then there was Bob Davidson, the treasurer, a retired accountant who got a disturbing thrill out of tallying penalties. He'd even bought himself a special calculator with satisfying clicking keys just so he could savor the sound of fines being added up. I stepped into this circus of bureaucracy wearing my father's old service cap and the most polite smile I could muster. Morning, Karen. I was hoping we could talk about this Pinnacle Development situation, I said. She didn't even look surprised, only amused, as if she'd been expecting me. Well, if it isn't Fred Miller, she said, dragging out the wrong name she'd been using for 8 years. I'd corrected her countless times, but by now I knew she did it on purpose, like a dog marking its territory. She opened a drawer and pulled out a paper with an official-looking red seal, waving it dramatically as if it were the Constitution itself. This, Fred, is a resolution passed unanimously by the HOA board to sell unused community property for the good of all residents. 3-0, completely legal. She slapped the document onto her desk with flair. Of course, I knew the so-called meeting had really been a drinking session at Mulligan's bar between Karen, Bob, and Maggie. They'd scribbled their decision on a cocktail napkin, and Karen had later typed it up, dressing it with a $12.99 novelty seal she'd bought online. The absurdity of it all might have been comical if it hadn't been so maddening. Bob sat off to the side, literally counting bills from a bag marked violation fees, grinning like a man in his element as his calculator clicked away. Maggie, meanwhile, was hunched over her clipboard, writing down every word we exchanged, occasionally asking me to spell things as though she were filing evidence in court. When I asked to see the required procedures for selling community land, Maggie immediately flipped open a 3-ring binder thicker than a phone book and rattled off passages she'd practically memorized. Karen leaned back, savoring her role. "Now Fred," she said, deliberately twisting the knife with the wrong name again, "I know this might be hard for someone your age to grasp, but times change. That land has sat there idle for years, doing nothing for anyone." I started to explain that I had been maintaining it, but she silenced me with a dismissive wave of her manicured hand. "Unauthorized use of community property is a violation, according to Bylaw 15.37. What you've done constitutes unauthorized improvement of a citizen and is subject to penalties." She read the bylaw aloud in a flat, practiced tone, like someone reciting lines she'd delivered 100 times. Then she announced that I owed the HOA $500 in back fees for the 5 years I had trespassed while maintaining the land. On top of that, she demanded I stop interfering with Pinnacle Development and sign a waiver stating that any future objections would count as harassment. Bob perked up at the mention of the fine, his fingers twitching with excitement as he imagined adding that money to his reports. Maggie wrote furiously, recording every detail as though her clipboard were gospel. As I turned to leave, Karen called out after me, her voice sweet as poison, "Oh, and Fred, you have until Friday to pay, or we'll be forced to escalate. Have a blessed day." It felt less like a meeting and more like being mugged by a church committee. But as I walked back to my truck, a thought struck me. Karen's act had been too smooth, too rehearsed. She was expecting me to challenge her, which meant she knew the sale wouldn't stand up under real scrutiny. That alone told me there was something rotten hiding in her paperwork. She thought she had me cornered. She was wrong. Later that evening, I sat on my porch, staring out at the lake when my phone rang sharply at 9 p.m. The voice on the other end was smooth, professional and colder than ice. "Mr. Miller," the caller said, "this is Jake Morrison from Pinnacle Development. We need to meet tomorrow morning." This isn't a request. Something in his tone made my skin crawl. This wasn't negotiation. This was intimidation. I told him to meet me at my cabin at 10 the next morning. If Jake wanted a showdown, I'd at least make sure it happened on my turf. The next day, a sleek black BMW rolled up my drive. Out stepped Jake Morrison, dressed in a charcoal gray suit that looked tailor-made, briefcase in hand. At 35, he carried himself with the smug assurance of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. His smile was perfect, his handshake firm, but his eyes were flat and lifeless. This was the kind of man who could bulldoze an orphanage and sleep soundly afterward. He strolled around my property like he already owned it, pausing to snap photos and take measurements, only addressing me when he needed me to move out of his way. Finally, he spread a set of architectural plans across my kitchen table without so much as asking. "Mr. Miller," he said coolly, "I wanted to review the development schedule for the Pine Ridge Luxury Resort." The plans revealed a sprawling complex of 200 guest rooms, 3 restaurants, a spa, and a marina that would carve up the natural shoreline. My 1,500 acres were mapped out as the centerpiece, a golf course, tennis courts, even a glamping village for tourists who wanted to pretend they were roughing it while ordering room service. It was a nightmare dressed in glossy marketing language, and Jake presented it like a done deal. Jake laid the blueprints flat on my table and spoke with the confidence of a man who thought the matter was already decided. "We purchased this property from your HOA for what I'd call a very friendly price, at $2.8 million. Market value is closer to $4.2 million. But our company has excellent relationships with certain broken bar local governing bodies." The way he said friendly made it obvious someone had taken a bribe, and the way he leaned on the phrase governing bodies told me this scheme reached higher than just Karen's petty empire. Jake continued, his tone sharp and clinical. "Under our agreement, you have 21 days to clear any personal belongings from the site and cease all unauthorized activities. If you refuse, legal consequences will follow. And those consequences, Mr. Miller, could be very costly for someone living on a fixed income." I decided to have a little sport with him. While he paced around, trying to measure distances near my garden, I just happened to be holding a running hose. Funny thing, the breeze carried the spray right into his fancy suit, soaking him from the shoulder down. Oh, terribly sorry, son, I said with my best innocent smile. These old hands aren't as steady as they used to be. Jake's professional grin wavered, but he swallowed his irritation. Then Bull bounded over, eager to greet our visitor, smearing muddy paw prints all over Jake's $1,000 outfit. By the time he shoved my retriever off, he looked like he'd crawled through a swamp. When he finally asked for directions back to the main road, I might have steered him toward the old logging trail. Just 3 times. His pristine BMW left my property caked in mud and pothole scars. Sorry about that, Jake, I told him sweetly. These country roads all look the same to me. You city folks might want to try one of those new GPS gizmos. By the time he limped his way back to civilization, Jake looked like he'd been through a natural disaster. But before leaving, he laid out his generous proposal. Mr. Miller, Pinnacle isn't unreasonable. We understand relocation can be difficult at your age. That's why we're offering you an arrangement. You can remain in your cabin if you sign a waiver releasing us from all liability and agree to pay a land use fee of $1,200 a month. And, assuming your dog doesn't interfere with resort operations, you can keep him as well. The arrogance in his voice was so thick you could slice it. He was essentially offering to let me rent my own home back from him, the very house my grandfather had built with his own hands. After Jake left, dripping mud and frustration, I sat on my porch, trying to process it all. That's when I remembered young Tommy Jang, the small-town lawyer who had just hung his shingle downtown, fresh out of law school, probably hungry for clients, maybe even willing to listen to an old man without charging a fortune. I called his office. To my surprise, he didn't brush me off. He actually sounded intrigued. Mr. Miller, he said, it sounds like your home may have acted far outside its legal authority. Bring me the paperwork, I'll take a look. For the first time in days, I felt the smallest spark of hope. Maybe David could still topple Goliath, especially if David carried a law degree. Tommy's office was crammed above a Chinese restaurant on Main Street, where the smell of egg rolls drifted through the floorboards. At 28, he looked exactly like a rookie attorney trying to survive in a small town. Energetic, a little overwhelmed, but fueled by ambition and instant ramen. His office was bare bones, a folding table, 2 mismatched chairs, and shelves packed with law books. When I explained my situation, his eyes lit up like a kid unwrapping a gift. If everything you've told me checks out, he said, your home may have committed multiple serious violations, but we'll need to start with the land records. At sunrise the next day, we headed to the Madison County Land Records office, an ugly concrete block that looked like it had been designed by someone who despised both buildings and people. Behind the counter was Margaret Kowalski, the records clerk who had been there for 3 decades. A small woman with steely hair and sharper eyes. She could sniff out a misplaced document like a bloodhound. What exactly are you gentlemen after? She asked, peering at us over her glasses. When Tommy explained, her face grew serious. Land disputes are my specialty. Let's dig. What she uncovered floored me. The 1,500 acres beside my property had been classified as Class B conservation land since 1987. That meant it could only be sold by the county's environmental board, and only with a public vote requiring 75% approval from residents. The HOA never had any authority over it. The designation explicitly banned residential or commercial development to preserve the ecosystem. Karen's so-called sale to Pinnacle wasn't just improper, it was flat-out illegal under state environmental law. But Margaret wasn't finished. She kept flipping through files until she pulled out a folder thick as a brick. Interesting, she muttered. Your HOA president filed a land transfer last month claiming to represent the county environmental board. She tapped the signature line. She signed under the name John Smith instead of John Smith, the real chairman, and she used a blue ballpoint pen. Official documents require black ink. Margaret glanced up at us, her expression sharp with disgust. Gentlemen, this is amateur forgery. She couldn't even spell the man's name correctly. Tommy scribbled notes furiously, barely containing his excitement. Mr. Miller, Listen to these. A financial records show your HOA's been collecting something called public land maintenance fees for the past 15 years. $50 per month from 47 households. That's about $423,000 total. He checked his math twice, then looked up, and none of it appears in the official HOA statements. It's vanished. The weight of it hit me hard. Karen hadn't just abused her authority, she'd been running a full-scale embezzlement racket for over a decade. Margaret pulled out another yellowing document, her eyes gleaming. And here's one more thing. The original HOA bylaws from 1995 contain a clause most people have forgotten. She cleared her throat and began to read aloud. If the board of directors violates state law in any real estate transaction, all HOA assets broken. The bylaw Margaret uncovered was like striking gold. It clearly stated that if the board ever broke state laws in real estate dealings, all control of the HOA and its assets would pass to the first legitimate complainant. Tommy and I just stared at each other in disbelief. Hidden in those dusty files was the weapon we needed to dismantle Karen's empire. As we left the records office, a nagging doubt tugged at me. I turned to Tommy. Son, I need you to level with me. This is your first real case, isn't it? His cheeks flushed, and he looked down at his shoes before admitting, yes, sir. I passed the bar half a year ago, and you're my first actual client. I know that doesn't sound reassuring, but I've lived and breathed these laws for years. And what Karen did is so blatantly illegal, even a rookie law student could win this fight. His candor stirred something in me. Here was a young man, green but determined, ready to stand toe-to-toe with giants simply because it was right. I clapped a hand on his shoulder. You know, sometimes the best fighter is the one who doesn't realize he's supposed to lose. My old man used to say young soldiers fight hardest, because they don't know enough to be scared yet. We've got truth on our side, Tommy, that's worth more than all the money in the world. We laid out a bold plan: file suit against the HOA for the illegal land sale, demand an audit of the so-called maintenance fees, and invoke that 1995 bylaw to transfer authority directly to me. It was risky, maybe even crazy, but the evidence was stacked in our favor. Karen had grown careless, too confident, leaving behind a trail of proof strong enough to bury her. Just as we reached Tommy's car, Margaret called after us. One more thing you should know: Karen registered a private business last year, Smithfield Properties. Listed herself as sole owner. Claims it manages real estate for HOAs. I'd be real interested to see where her inventory came from. The very next week, Tommy filed an emergency lawsuit at the county courthouse. The charges: unlawful sale of conservation land, embezzlement of association funds, forgery of government signatures, and operating a shell company for laundering money. I was listed as the key witness, with years of documentation to prove my stewardship of the disputed property. Walking into that courthouse felt like stepping onto a battlefield. Only here, the weapons were legal motions and cross-examinations. The stakes were no less deadly. 3 generations of my family's legacy hung on the 28-year-old lawyer's ability to outmaneuver the most expensive attorneys money could buy. Karen didn't waste time. Within 2 days, she'd retained Mason Associates, the biggest, priciest law firm in 3 counties. Their fees started at $800 an hour and climbed from there. Their headquarters, with its marble floors and leather chairs, screamed intimidation. She also hit back with a countersuit, accusing me of defamation, property damage, and intentional infliction of emotional distress due to spousal bereavement. That last part cut deep, painting me as unstable and unhinged in my grief for Martha. But Karen wasn't satisfied with just a legal battle. She tried to sway public opinion too, staging what she dramatically called a community protection rally on her front lawn. The turnout: her brother from Milwaukee, 2 neighbors, and a stray dog that wandered up to the snack table. When the local paper snapped a picture of her giving a fiery speech to 3 people and a golden retriever, the headlining HOA president holds lonely rally became the laughingstock of town. Meanwhile, Mason Associates rolled out their favorite weapon: delay tactics. They filed endless motions demanding psychiatric evaluations for me, environmental impact assessments for the land, and depositions from irrelevant witnesses. Their senior partner, Richard Mason, a silver-haired shark with decades of courtroom experience, sneered at Tommy during one hearing. "Mr. Jang, You've stumbled into the big leagues. You sure you're ready for this kind of game? While Tommy wrestled with their endless paperwork, I dug into Karen's finances. Turned out, her Smithfield Properties scheme was more sinister than we thought. She'd been quietly buying up distressed homes in our neighborhood, preying on families teetering on foreclosure. She'd pay pennies on the dollar, then flip the properties to Pinnacle for 3 times as much. In just 2 years, she'd pocketed nearly $500,000 so while families were forced to leave town. That's when Detective Ray Morales came into play. A 55-year-old retired cop, Ray had served with my son-in-law overseas before moving into small-town law enforcement. When I told him what was happening, he didn't hesitate. "Frank, I've had my eye on that woman for years. Looks like she finally gave us the crack we needed." Ray's patience and meticulous nature made him the perfect man to untangle Karen's schemes, and he worked fast. The hardest blow came in court, though. Mason's lawyers subjected me to brutal questioning, forcing me to relive Martha's illness in excruciating detail. One attorney asked, with faint sympathy, "Mr. Miller, isn't it true your obsession with this land is just a symptom of your inability to accept your wife's passing?" I broke down on the stand, tears streaming as I tried to explain that maintaining her garden wasn't madness, it was devotion. It was love. Watching a grieving man attacked in that way was almost too much for the judge himself to stomach. But just as I thought the weight of it all might crush me, Ray came through. His digging uncovered something that changed everything. In 2018, Karen had been arrested in North Carolina for insurance fraud. She'd staged a car crash for the payout. Karen's past finally caught up with her. Detective Ray dug into old files and discovered she'd once been arrested in North Carolina for staging a car crash to collect insurance money. Though the charges were dropped after she agreed to leave the state and stay clean for 10 years, the pattern was obvious. Ray explained it best. She finds a position of authority, bleeds it for profit, and disappears when things get too hot. This time, though, she picked the wrong mark. As the case dragged on and Karen's lawyers buried us in motions, I could see the strain wearing on Tommy. One night, in his cluttered office, he admitted what I already suspected. "Mr. Miller, they've got resources I can't compete with. They're filing so many motions I can barely keep up. And I'm worried the jury won't even understand what Karen's done wrong." For a moment, I considered telling him to quit, to spare himself the pain of losing his first case. But then I remembered my father's words: "Some fights are worth the bruises, no matter the odds." Then came the call that changed everything. At 11 o'clock on a Sunday night, just as I was turning in, Tommy's voice came through the line, trembling with excitement. "Mr. Miller, Margaret found more records. Karen didn't just sell your conservation land, she's been working to sell all 47 homes in the neighborhood." The truth was staggering. Karen had twisted an obscure clause in the 1995 HOA bylaws, which gave the association authority over public assets. Over the years, she quietly expanded public to mean every single property in the neighborhood without the homeowners ever knowing. Her scheme was breathtaking in scale. She had already negotiated a deal with Pinnacle worth nearly $18 million. The plan? Force out all 47 families within 6 months, bulldoze the homes, and replace them with the Pine Ridge Mega Resort, a casino, golf course, and luxury marina. The most absurd detail came when I read the contracts with my father's old magnifying glass. In her haste, Karen had listed her address as 123 Elm Street instead of 123 Pine Street. That clerical error meant she had accidentally sold her neighbor Mrs. Patterson's house instead of her own. Poor Mrs. Patterson must have wondered why realtors were sending her congratulations. 7 days after we filed suit, the emergency hearing was held. Judge Williams, a seasoned veteran of property disputes, presided. Karen marched in with her 4 lawyers from Mason Associates, while Tommy and I sat at a small table with nothing but our files and the truth. Tommy's hands trembled at first, but his voice steadied as he cited Wisconsin state law, Article 47.3, any HOA that commits serious violations automatically forfeits authority to the first homeowner who files a legal challenge, a law almost forgotten since it was written in 1987 but binding nonetheless. The judge reviewed the evidence in silence, the air so tense you could hear Karen tapping her fingernails against the table. Finally, Judge Williams looked up and delivered the verdict. Mr. Frank Miller is hereby recognized as the lawful manager of the Willowbrook Community HOA, with authority over all 47 properties and community assets. The bailiff placed the HOA office keys into my hand, right there in the courtroom. Karen's face turned from white to red to a dangerous shade of purple as she shrieked, "This is impossible. I've been president for 8 years." The judge calmly reminded her she was now just another resident subject to the rules I would enforce. But Ray wasn't finished. He stepped forward with a digital recorder containing Karen's own words, boasting to Bob Davidson about the $2 million bonus she'd pocket once Pinnacle paid out. Her smug confession filled the courtroom, sealing her fate. Still, Karen couldn't leave with dignity. As the bailiff escorted her out, she lunged for the keys in my hand, convinced that possession meant power. The brief scuffle ended with her dragged toward the exit while Bob and Maggie vanished, unwilling to be tied to her downfall. Judge Williams then declared Karen's Pinnacle contract null and void. Every scheme she had woven over 8 years collapsed in an instant. She had underestimated me, and more importantly, underestimated the strength of truth. Walking out of the courthouse with those keys, I felt my grandfather's presence. Justice had been done, and for the first time in months, I could breathe. Neighbors and reporters crowded the steps. Even Mrs. Henderson, phone in hand, was broadcasting live via not to mock me, but to cheer. "Frank Miller, the man who took down the HOA," she proclaimed to the world. The next morning, I carried a box of supplies into what used to be Karen's office. On the door was a new nameplate, Willowbrook Community managed by Frank Miller. The first order of business was tearing down Karen's wall of shame, where she'd plastered photos of so-called violations like hunting trophies. One by one, her relics came down, replaced with the promise of a neighborhood run with fairness, not fear. The first thing I did as president was strip away the nonsensy Karen's 247 ridiculous regulations, her brightly colored violation maps, and the giant poster that read like a military threat. In their place, I posted one simple rule: use common sense. Be kind to your neighbors. Keep your property respectably and mind your own business. It was like cracking open a long-sealed window and letting fresh air into the neighborhood. That evening, I called a community meeting. Every single one of the 47 families showed up, and the largest turnout anyone could remember. People who hadn't spoken in years came out, curious to see what would happen under new leadership. And then there was Karen. For the first time in nearly a decade, she had no throne to sit in, just a folding chair in the back row. Watching her sit quietly while wearing oversized sunglasses indoors, as if that could hide her, was a sight I'll never forget. The whispers and side glances told me her fall from power had traveled faster than she could run from it. Bob Davidson and Maggie Chen didn't dare show their faces. Standing at the podium where she had once barked orders, I cleared my throat and said, "Let's start with some good news." Effective immediately, monthly HOA fees dropped from $200 to $50 for everyone. The room erupted into cheers. Once the clapping died down, I added with a grin, "There is one exception. Karen Smithfield will continue paying $200, plus an extra $300 each month as an administrative misconduct recovery fee." The applause that followed nearly shook the walls. Even Mrs. Henderson shouted, "Serves her right." Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. I looked straight at Karen and said in the same condescending tone she'd used on us for years, "Karen, do you remember telling me, you lost, old man?" "I've been thinking about that. So, let me ask you in front of all these neighbors, who exactly lost here?" She sank deeper into her chair, silent behind those dark glasses. The silence that followed was more powerful than any answer she could have given. But I wasn't finished. "As your new HOA president, I've added some new rules. First, Karina, you must submit a written application for any exterior change, including lawn mowing. Your grass height is now officially set at 2.5 inches and no more, no less. Second, your house must be painted pink within 30 days. I think it fits your style." The room filled with stifled laughter as Karen's fists clenched tight. Her humiliation was only the beginning. Within 3 months, the courts handed down her punishment: 2 years probation, 500 hours of community service. Ironically, on the conservation land she tried to sell and repayment of the $42,300 she skimmed from fake maintenance fees. Her company, Smithfield Properties, was dissolved, its assets seized to pay restitution. Karen, once the self-styled Queen of Willowbrook, was reduced to an ordinary resident struggling with bills and forced to live under rules she couldn't bend. Meanwhile, others thrived. Tommy Jang became something of a folk hero. Within weeks, a dozen other families hired him to fight their own abusive hoes. He upgraded from his tiny upstairs office to a proper firm with assistants, telling me over coffee, "Mr. Miller, you taught me that the most important cases aren't always the big ones, they're the ones where ordinary folks refuse to let bullies win." Ray Morales accepted my offer to serve as community security director, which mostly meant keeping an eye on Karen and making sure she didn't stir up trouble, and the land that started it all was transformed into Martha's Memorial Garden. Rows of sunflowers, the flowers she loved most, bloomed under a plaque that read, "Dedicated to Martha Miller, and to all who believe some things are worth fighting for," funded by the Karen Smithfield Restitution Fund. Each morning, I walked my dog through the garden, sometimes passing Karen on her way to the bus stop. She never looked at me, never said a word. That suited me just fine. One evening, sitting on the porch with Tommy and Ray, I let them in on a secret. "Boys, I knew about that 1995 bylaw from the very start." Their jaws dropped. Tommy nearly spilled his beer. "Then why didn't you use it?" I smiled at the lake. "Because if I'd pulled it out early, Karen would have faced a slap on the wrist. By letting her think she was winning, I gave her enough rope to hang herself." The sweetest irony came 6 months later when Karen was forced to rent a studio apartment carved out of the old home meeting room for $600 a month, payable to me. She had to file written requests just to adjust her thermostat or hang a picture. The woman who fined people for mailbox colors now needed permission to plant tomatoes. As my grandfather used to say, justice tastes best with a side of irony. But the story wasn't done. 3 weeks later, the phone rang. "Mr. Miller, this is Jake Morrison from Pinnacle Development. After recent events with Ms. Smithfield, we'd like to offer you a business proposal, something I think you'll find interesting." I looked out at the lake my family had cherished for generations and smiled. "I'm listening, Jake, but this time, we play by my rules. Because in this country, land is more than soil. It's family, it's freedom, it's proof that hard work and honesty still matter. No amount of money, no corrupt system, no stack of papers can take that from people willing to fight for what's right. And sometimes, it takes an old man to remind the world that the American dream isn't about getting rich quick, it's about protecting what matters and leaving something better behind." So let me ask you, have you ever felt powerless under the thumb of someone abusing authority? A cruel boss, a petty hoe president, a bully hiding behind their title? Frank Miller's fight is proof that one determined person can topple a corrupt system. If his story inspired you, or if you've had your own run-in with neighborhood tyrants, join our community here at HOA Stories. We're building a place where justice, courage, and perseverance still count. What's your HOA nightmare story?